I know I was in the room, so I have only myself to blame, but either Joe or Shelley or Tracy suggested that at the very end of a 3-day conference we were co-hosting, I should present a piece of my own research. And I apparently raised no objection. Many of you are already familiar with some portions of this project. My political economic homology between the mass print era and what roughly parallels Sam Clemens' lifetime, which roughly parallels Sam Clemens' lifetime, and the digital era that we are now living through. My paper today very directly follows on a Trouble Begins lecture I gave last year. And other portions of the project have made it their way to the Mark Twain Annual, Los Angeles Review of Books, and marktwainstudies.org. So if you want to get more details about Twain's collisions with the San Francisco police, I'll point you in that direction. As I'm going to summarize those episodes today so that I can spend more time on the theory of racialized media witnessing, which connects the disgraceful stoning of a Chinaman in 1864 with the police murder of George Floyd in 2020. But before I go further, I feel I must say something about why Twain's treatment of racialized policing is interesting to me. I do admire some of what he says and does as a police reformer. But it's not what it proves or doesn't prove about Twain that I care most about. Rather, it is the structures of power that Twain's work renders visible. Structures which are remarkably durable, remarkably unchanged, and sometimes only excavated from the historical record through a person who has the privilege of public protest. So, let us abolish policemen who carry revolvers and clubs, Mark Twain said, no doubt relishing the pregnant pause, before adding, and put in a squad of poets armed to the teeth with poems on spring and love. Looking out from the dais across the ballroom of the Lotus Club, he would have seen nothing but the faces of New York's GOP establishment, including the recently inaugurated Vice President, Theodore Roosevelt. The club was replete with state legislators enjoying their party's 8th consecutive session of control over both houses in Albany. And on this occasion, they were joined by numerous officers from the ranks of the New York Police Department. Twain was ostensibly toasting the Republican governor, Benjamin Odell, who within months of taking office had succeeded in pressing through a controversial bill which reorganized command of the municipal police forces, and according to its critics, was designed to further concentrate Republican power by giving the governor greater authority over police commissioners in the urban areas presumed to be Democratic strongholds. Roosevelt had pursued this legislation during his own tenure as governor and as president of the New York City Board of Police Commissioners. But it was Odell, in homage to the emergent boss of his party on the national as well as the New York stage, who finally signed it into law. Beware the curse of getting what you want. In the coming years, the highly partisan wrangling over the police bill would become centerpiece of what Daniel Zistrom calls the police scandal that launched the progressive era. In the next election, Odell would lose the governor's office to a prosecutor who won corruption cases against him, and soon thereafter his party would lose both houses of the New York legislature. Nobody assembled at the Lotus Club that Saturday night in March of 1901 knew what was coming, Twain included. But one can argue that the unraveling began when they allowed him to hijack the event. Due to the unprecedented cultural celebrity Twain enjoyed during this period, we have an exhaustive record of what he was doing almost every day. But in spite of this, I have been unable to establish who invited him to the police bill banquet. It may very well have been knowing that his famous face would get him through the doors of the Lotus Club on any occasion, Twain crashed the party. He proceeded to make himself the turd in the punch bowl of the Vice President Roosevelt's hard-won police bill, the opening salvo in a media war between the two men which would last for the remainder of Twain's lifetime. Twain well knew those words, "Let us abolish policemen," would run in newspapers across the eastern seaboard, that really whatever he said thereafter, and whatever collective exhale it might have produced in the room, didn't matter. His presence at the event would drive public interest in what had taken place there, an occasion which had begun with Republican leadership signing autographs for wives of patrolmen, and the governor receiving a series of standing ovations from men in uniform, ended with reporters running to get the words "abolish policemen" to press. Likely nobody at the Lotus Club that evening, save Twain himself, could remember what he had written 34 years earlier upon being released from an NYPD holding cell. "I am glad I got into the station house, because it will teach me to never so far forget all moral principles as to compliment a police force again." Twain's flame war with American police has been, at least until recently, one of the regrettable lacunae in Twain's studies. Gary Scharnhorst started documenting it in 1990 and refined that account in the first volume of his recent biography. But it somehow eludes most surveys of Twain's San Francisco days, including that by Ben Tarnoff, our keynote speaker 5 years ago. Even Scharnhorst underestimates, I think, the degree of danger Twain put himself in with his relentless polemics, only some of which have survived. The extent of his risk is hinted at in the fledgling San Francisco Dramatic Chronicle. When fellow Bohemian newsmen, not knowing how else to reliably communicate with the itinerant freelancer, used their columns to warn him when police were allaying for him and plead with him to stay sober. Also missing, even from Gary's account, is the unambiguous vigilantism of the SFPD under the command of Martin Burke. Burke had been one of the ringleaders. This gets to the question of insurrection in America that I think we are often unaware of. Burke had been one of the ringleaders of a violent coup d'etat in the mid-1850s, during which he and his allies, calling themselves the Committee of Vigilance, overthrew the duly elected municipal government and violently dismantled San Francisco's democratic political machine. Following a siege on government buildings, a series of lynchings and banishments, the vigilantes nominated a People's Party ticket and held a sham election, which made Chief Burke, as Twain put it, the autocrat of San Francisco with absolute power. Burke expropriated and rapidly expanded the city's policing infrastructure, focused on suppressing the political power of the city's Irish Catholics, backbone of the ousted democratic machine, and the potential economic power of the Chinese. A coalition of white Protestant merchants bankrolled the vigilantes, who reciprocated by driving down taxes and tariffs, which improved the merchants' credit with East Coast and European counterparties. But they feared the industrious and entrepreneurial Chinese might open up new supply chains and introduce new products and services. Police, though, could hamstring such commercial development through racketeering. The emblem of Burke's police force, this is at the Bancroft and at Berkeley, the emblem of Burke's police force became the Bowie knife issued to officers for the purpose of enforcing rackets by torture. To initiate a public crusade against Burke's myrmidons, as Twain called them, you probably know the reference to Achilles, was verging on suicidal, as we all know Twain was at that time. But it worked. The widening arc of the publicity he generated eventually reached the State House. Burke was forced to submit to a state-run election and he chose to resign instead. What followed was one of the first large-scale police reform projects in U.S. history, though its effects were neither adequate nor permanent. In San Francisco, Twain learned his deep distrust of the police and the emergent American myth which Roosevelt would play a crucial role in perpetuating. According to this myth, police are personifications of justice and peace, protectors of public safety, reluctant executors of a state monopoly on violence, and reliable sources of testimony about what they observe in the course of their duties. Twain, to the contrary, recognized police, at least in San Francisco, as coercive agents of partisan agendas, entrenched economic power, and most of all, white supremacy. But though I think, as Scharnhorst does, that Twain is due much credit for disrupting vigilante rule in San Francisco, he is no revolutionary, nor is he an activist as we would now define one. Twain is more accurately a media witness. The concept of media witnessing was introduced around the turn of the 21st century. It is associated with the popularization of cinema verite technique and the anticipation of increasing mobility and miniaturization of media technology, making coverage, capture, and transmission of events, even unexpected events, increasingly seamless and simultaneous. The distinctions between eyewitness testimony and products created to satisfy market demand for eyewitness testimony becomes ever harder to parse in the succession of world historical events from Desert Storm to the invasion of Ukraine, interlaced with the popularization of reality shows, mockumentaries, social media, virtual and augmented reality. Jean Baudrillard theorizes the policing of events during the millennial era as a concurrence of reality and simulation within the totalizing structures of unilateral U.S. military power and finance capitalism, which renders every war, natural disaster, or political uprising already a non-occurrence, or at best a sentimental fiction, one which is forced to compete with other fictions for eyeballs and entertainment dollars. Rarely can any documentation of events create enough of a breach in the convenient cacophony of contemporary mass media to spur collective action on the scale required for systemic change. But such breaches, when they do occur, are exemplary of media witnessing. And as Alyssa Richardson argues, they are almost always racialized. For the breach to occur, it must be appendable to the eroded but not eradicated infrastructure of civil rights advocacy in the US, one of the few enduring countervailing powers. It must permeate through the subcultural networks, what Richardson calls interlocking black public spheres, which are resilient in spite of their incompatibility with the prevailing profit models. And it must be a vehicle for the weighty baggage of atrocity, which forms a connective tissue between oppressed people that transcends place. The epitome of media witnessing, characteristic almost to the point of being definitional, is documentation of racialized police violence, like the murder of George Floyd recorded by Darnella Frazier on Memorial Day 2020. That Frazier received a Pulitzer Prize hints at what Twain came to believe was an intrinsic oppositional relationship between mass media and the monopoly of violence embodied in the police. One of the most formative moments in Twain's career, by his own account, was his media witnessing of the disgraceful stoning of a Chinaman in the spring of 1864. The scene provides the foundation for Twain's idiosyncratic definition of news, which closely resembles contemporary definitions of media witnessing. Merely appearing in a newspaper or any other news medium does not necessarily qualify something as news by Twain's reckoning. The vagaries of what we now call the news cycle are not properly news at all, according to Twain. Most of the content in newspapers and news broadcasts is transitory and degradable. But true news, as Twain defines it, cannot grow stale. The permanence of its primacy is what makes it news. It is evergreen, always as captivating now as it was at the moment of its conception. Time cannot destroy that interest. It cannot even fade it, Twain says. This immortality, what Jeffrey Insko calls the everlasting now, is not the only thing which distinguishes Twain's conceptualization of news from its standard definitions. What makes something news, according to Twain, is the felt intensity of its subjectivity. For Twain, only that which emanates from an eyewitness has the potential to resonate. The eyewitness's narrative that stirs the heart today, Twain says, will as surely and as profoundly stir it 1,000 years hence. Not every eyewitness account is news, but there is not news which is not an eyewitness account. As he develops this definition across a series of entries in his autobiography, most of them written in 1906, Twain offers several excerpts from periodicals he subscribes to. But the originary example is his own account of that disgraceful stoning, tragically suppressed from public view. As he summarizes it 42 years later, I saw some hoodlums chasing and stoning a Chinaman who was heavily laden with the weekly wash of his Christian customers. And I noticed that a policeman was observing this performance with an amused interest, nothing more. He did not interfere. For the first time since he arrived in San Francisco, Twain felt like his job mattered. Here was an event he could describe with considerable warmth and holy indignation. It needed no embellishment. There was fire in it, Twain said, and I believed it was literature. Most nights, by the time he submitted his columns, he was disgusted by them. But on this occasion, proud that this item had come from a live heart, he went looking for it in the Monday morning call. It wasn't there. He recounts, it wasn't there the next morning, nor the next. I went up to the composing room and found it tucked away among condemned matter on the standing galley. Twain confronted his boss, George Barnes, who explained that the call could not afford to publish articles criticizing the hoodlums for stoning Chinamen. The hoodlums belonged to the white working classes who were the stay and support of the morning call. They hated Chinamen, Barnes said, and he must respect their prejudice or perish. The event haunted Twain. It ruined his relationship with Barnes. He started actively shirking his responsibilities to the call, collecting a paycheck for as long as he could, then resigning before he could be fired. For the remainder of his tenure in San Francisco, he would never again hold a salaried post. He became a permanent freelancer. Liberated from any single publisher's scruples, Twain started taking big, satiric swings at many targets, foremost the police. It's unclear whether Twain's preference for the gig economy of periodical publishing was a conscious strategy or just amenable to his lifestyle, but the result was that local, regional, and eventually national newspapers found themselves competing for his services. He no longer lived in fear of censorship. If editors found something he wrote too risky to print, Twain had only to shop it to their rivals or threaten to. It is through this episode that Twain comes to recognize the intrinsically oppositional relationship between the police and the press, who are engaged in competition over the authority to witness. Their rivalry persists from the points of access to the sites of testimony. Regina Lawrence divides the narratives of news media into two categories, the institutionally driven and the event-driven. The peculiar commercial demands of periodical publication require the establishment and maintenance of routines of content creation. These routines, or beats, develop around institutions, courts, markets, municipal buildings, ports, schools, theaters, and police precincts. Reporters can reliably depend on these institutions as sources for content. In exchange for this reliability, which enables the routinization of news media, spokespeople and other members representing these institutions are assured disproportionate influence. An official narrative is always represented in press coverage. and frequently it is the only narrative, leaving the impression that it is definitive. Institutionally driven content is predictable. Both journalists and their cultivated sources can to some degree anticipate the newsworthiness of things like concerts and earnings reports, elections, IPOs, and sporting events. Event-driven narratives fall outside of this routinization, either because they fall outside of jurisdiction of human institutions, like natural disasters, for instance, or because they are imbued with an unanticipated newsworthiness. In event-driven narratives, the accounts of institutional officials are not granted their accustomed privilege. They have to compete with other sources who may not have established an ongoing relationship with the press, but who possess some form of special experience, expertise, or position, which is likely to make their perspective compelling to readers. By comparison with institutionally driven journalism, event-driven journalism is relatively rare, but is also the object of outsized public interest. Conspicuously, event-driven narratives, police killings, political scandals, corporate fraud, are prone to expose institutions and their associated officials as unreliable. Thus, a very small quantity of event-driven journalism has the capacity to alter public perception of an entire tide of institutionally driven journalism that precedes it. The enduring paradox of news media, to cover breaking news, eyewitness news, the fractional content of which Twain reserves for the distinction news, which is what the public most desperately seeks, is often to debunk and discredit large portions of the content which fills the pages and airways of your publication on a daily basis. Take, for instance, the Lotus Club banquet I narrated at the outset. Among the primary objects of this social gathering was to produce an official account of the passage of the police bill. Numerous prominent spokespeople for the city, state, party, and federal institutions came together at a specified time and place, having invited their press contacts, to present a unified rationale for supporting this controversial piece of legislation. All in attendance, reporters included, likely anticipated the tireless resuscitation of a party line. They did not anticipate Twain's toast, the incendiary content of which starkly contrasted the rote performances of the official spokespeople. His celebrity combined with dissonance between his statements and the party line turned the routine into the unexpected, shifted the narrative from institutional to event-driven, and by doing so moved it to a more prominent place in the periodical, assuring more eyeballs on it, while also undermining and suppressing the authority of the official narrative. The Republicans were forced into damage control mode. As I have elsewhere discussed, going to war with Twain in the press was such a futile proposition. His most desired antagonist, Theodore Roosevelt, refrained entirely. The man who invented the bully pulpit would rather let his legislation die, would rather let his party lose control, would rather just about anything than engage Mark Twain in a troll fight. The tension within any news organization to this day is like the one which divided Twain and Barnes. The airing of event-driven narratives, media witnessing, or what Twain defines as news, is not something which is by any means assured. The public's access to media witnesses is something which journalists have to fight for, often against the momentum of their profession and the ingrained assumption of their employers, which is why successful breaches of media witnessing are so rare, even verging on extinct. Thank you.